Here for the entire proceeding, as the chair mentioned, besides, I guess, memory issues potentially related to his training record, did Chief Pop provide any false testimony to the personnel board?
I'm not aware of it yet.
Okay. And did Chief Pop provide any misleading testimony to the personnel board?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. And I want to go into some context behind some of the things you said on direct before I get into some of the meat of where my outline was. You recognize that this board can recommend the modifications of findings and discipline, correct?
Yes, sir.
And if this board modifies the findings to say that there was no intentional integrity issue and the city manager accepts any modifications, that would constitute the official finding of the city, correct?
That's correct. My understanding.
And you talked about your experience on the As-Post board. I guess we can disclose to the board that you and I have talked many times when I've presented before the board, right?
Yes, sir.
The As-Post board has not moved forward with even initiating proceedings against Commander Minor, right?
At this time, that's my understanding, yes. I missed the meeting Wednesday, and I didn't see the agenda.
Okay, I can represent to you because I did see it, that he was not on the agenda. They haven't initiated proceedings. Additionally, there are times when the As-Post board waits to initiate proceedings until after the outcome of an appeal, correct?
I'm not too sure I would know that. I only know what comes before the board. I don't know what the process is.
So let me ask you this to see if you are aware. Are you aware as to whether As-Post staff communicates with attorneys for potential people that appear as to the merits or the timing of investigations?
I would hope they would have some conversation with you, yes.
Okay. So are you aware that the board will inevitably consider any findings of this personnel board that are adopted, as well as the recorded testimony and evidence that are presented here in deciding whether to take an action against Commander Minor certification?
And you refresh my memory, I do believe that when they do present, they do talk about the current status of the case. That's correct, yes.
Right, and I guess for the personnel board's edification, since this came up before, in the event that the As-Post board decides to take potential action against Commander Minor's certification, that would be reviewed in a different proceeding, correct?
That is correct, yes.
So basically there's a hearing sort of like this, different rules, different people, but there's a hearing like this where evidence is presented, correct?
That's with the administrative law judge?
Yes. And then the proceedings and your testimony and the findings of the board and all that other stuff is actually evidence that's admissible before the administrative law judge, right?
I expect so, yes.
Because it's stuff that you hear about when the board sits again to decide on certification action, correct?
That's correct, I believe so, yes.
So the findings of the board and the adoption of the city is material evidence that the As-Post board considers in deciding whether to revoke somebody's certification, for example.
Yes, sir.
So if this board decided to overturn the termination and said this isn't an intentional integrity violation, this was essentially miscommunication, that factor would be considered by the As-Post board in the certification action, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You gave testimony earlier that there were no members of the Scottsdale Police Department that are currently on the Maricopa County's Brady list, correct?
That's my knowledge, there are no current members, that's correct.
Okay. And you've been the chief for a long time. You're aware that you receive a notification if one of your current or former officers are placed on the Maricopa County Brady list, correct?
I should, I don't remember seeing any.
Okay. And you're aware that as of right now, Commander Minor is not on the Maricopa County Brady list?
That is correct.
Okay. And you're aware that there is actually some due process elements to placement on the Maricopa County's Brady list, correct?
Yes, sir.
And even if someone were to be placed on the Brady list, if new information like a finding on appeal exists, the officer could then be removed from the Brady list, right?
I would hope so, yes, sir.
And do you know who Darren Viner is?
I don't recognize that name.
Okay, so you don't recognize Darren Viner as a former employee from the Scottsdale Police Department and a current Phoenix commander?
Yeah, I
Okay. You were asked the question initially by the vice chair about your posture and your potential acceptance of a finding. As the police chief, would you accept the factual finding of this board if they find that Commander Minor did not intentionally lie to internal affairs?
probably have to, yes, sir.
Okay. And additionally, you're moving on to a different phase of your career starting December 1, right?
That's correct, yes, sir.
So So after December 1st, no matter what the finding of the board, if adopted, you and Commander Minor would not be working with each other in a professional capacity, correct?
That's true, yes.
Okay. To provide some additional context, we've been part of the internal representation process, you and me also, for several Scottsdale police employees when you've been chief. And I think you've talked about a mantra of getting caught doing the right thing. This concept came up in this investigation, and before we begin, can you tell the board what the philosophy is behind your statement that you want to get caught doing the right thing?
I think this concept came up as a result of the investigation into the use of force with the canine officer and the street officer. I don't think it came into context with this case.
Okay.
And that really is, if we know something needs to be looked into, it should be looked into, we should look into it and get it resolved before it's seized by a records request or lawsuit or some other way. We should have that information available to us so that when people say, oh, this occurred, we can demonstrate, yeah, we knew about it, here's the action we took, here's what it resulted as a result of the action we took. That's getting caught in things right. People find out about something, they look into it, they find we already knew about it, we already handled it.
Okay. So I'm going to keep that concept in mind, and I'm probably going to keep on coming back to it during the cross-examination. I want to go back to our conversation. I want to go back to before any of the investigations that we are going to address today in detail took place. So prior to any of this happening, do you remember Chief Slavin alleging an AR-333 violation against Commander Minor?
I was aware of it, Chief Pop was handling it, I did not involve myself with it, but I was aware of it, yes.
So you'd ask Chief Pop to look into this to see if it merited anything for an internal investigation?
I think Chief Slavin actually went to Chief Pop and asked about it.
But then you approved
I
from
would
Chief?
notify them, I would disapprove of that.
Okay. Would you say that that's a fact-finding effort by Chief Pop?
It's fair assessment.
Okay, and it's not uncommon for you to ask Chief Pop to do fact-finding prior to deciding on whether to move forward with internal affairs, right?
I don't know if I've ever done that, in terms of go out and look into it. I think Chief Slavin went to Chief Pop with his concerns, as I remember it, and Chief Pop looked into Chief Slavin's concerns.
So that was the first time you've ever done that for Scottsdale?
I guess it's the first time I've ever done it, I just, in terms of doing it all the time, I don't think I've ever said, go look into this. Clearly, I get issues from the community all the time about some officer did something, and it goes, hey, look into this. And then if it turns out that it's a violation, you might turn to an internal affairs investigation, which has been dealt with. But I don't, it's not a, other than those kinds of small issues, I don't go and say, here's what should be an internal affairs investigation, look into it first and then decide. Generally, the complaint that is obviously on its face should be investigated against internal affairs.
Okay.
Coordinate the investigation.
So it was unusual for Chief Slavin to actually ask something like an AR-333 violation for Chief Pop to look into it? That's an unusual circumstance?
I know when you talk about the fact that Aaron is in Chief Pop's chain of command, is it appropriate for Chief Slavin to go to Chief Pop and say, I've got a concern about one of the people in your chain of command? I don't think that's improper at all. Does it happen all the time? I don't, sitting here, I can't recall a lot of times it's happened. To answer your question, I guess the answer is, yeah, how do you ask the question? Affirmative or negative?
Well, I think your context
Okay,
explains.
thanks.
So on a number of occasions, Chief Slavin has actually brought issues with Commander Minor to Chief Pop, right?
You'd have to ask them that. I'm going to tell you what I know.
Okay. But after Chief Pop looked into this first AR-333 violation against Commander Minor, you chose not to initiate an internal affairs investigation, right?
Chief Pop said that he didn't see anything that rose to that level, and I didn't disagree with him.
And you trusted the decision, or you trusted this decision was accurate because you trust Chief Pop's judgment?
In this case, I did, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to switch gears and move forward in time to the misconduct investigation into Chief Slavin. So you became aware that Chief Slavin made comments which violated the policies of the Scottsdale Police Department during the command staff meeting. You don't remember what specifically you were told the comments were? Is that your testimony?
Yeah, I think probably my problem is I've heard so much then and since to sit here with clarity and say, here's the quotation, it would not be, I may not be accurate. And so in terms of accuracy, I know the context, or at least what was contained in the comments, but I wouldn't want to tell you this thing I now know, is that I knew that.
Did Chief Slavin tell you that he had heard from a lieutenant that his comments had offended members of the police department, or did you think that he was coming forward on his own?
No, he told me that what had occurred at the meeting, that he was approached by a lieutenant who told him that his comments were inappropriate, or however he said it, and brought to his attention. Chief Slavin told me that at the moment he was approached, he didn't fully remember exactly what he said, and he was reminded of what he said, and then he came and saw me.
But you're very clear sitting here today, it's your testimony before the board, that Chief Slavin told you about two different comments?
Yes, because I can't think who else would have told me about Lieutenant Myers. I'm not too sure he used Myers' name at the time. I can't say he gave me that, but no one else talked to me about it. I didn't interview anybody. Aaron didn't come see me. Bob didn't see me. I'm pretty sure I had to get the information from somewhere. And so I knew at that time that he had turned to an employee and either said, because the employee knew the name of the newspaper, are you gay, or because you know the name of the newspaper, you must be gay.
Okay. Sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So then, you said that you were copied on the apology email, right?
That's correct.
Did you read the apology email?
I did, yes, sir.
Did you note that the apology email only apologized for making a single comment?
To be honest with you, sir, I didn't get caught up in whether it was plural or singular. I was more concerned about him making sure that everybody in that room knew that, one, he reported to me, that I was aware of it, and two, that he was very contrite about what he had done. That was my focus, not the numbers. I guess I viewed it as all-inclusive.
Okay. So then, I guess that next Tuesday, so the next day that Chief Pop was at work, Chief Pop came into a meeting with both you and Chief Slavin, and Chief Pop disclosed to you guys that Lieutenant Bonnet and Commander Minor had brought forward a complaint about what happened. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
So Chief Slavin knew from the beginning that Lieutenant Bonnet and Commander Minor had an issue related to the comment that he made, right?
Let's explain what the beginning is.
Okay.
Where's your beginning point? Because I don't know that he knew that when he came in and talked to me the first time.
Okay. That's fair. But at least by the Tuesday after the meeting, Chief Slavin knew that Lieutenant Bonnet and Commander Minor had gone through their chain of command to Chief Pop to say, we have a problem with what happened, right?
I don't have a real clear recollection of that meeting, because Chief Pop said that occurred, and I believe Chief Pop was accurate.
Okay. Now, I guess, did Chief Slavin's comments offend you?
Well, offenses, I know the PC answer would be yes, I'm offended, but I gotta be honest with you, I think I was more disappointed in his behavior than I was offended by his behavior.
Okay. So you're not offended by the comments?
I'm disappointed in his behavior, and the fact he made those comments.
Okay. Are you directly offended by the comments?
I think when I say I'm not offended, or was not offended at the time, I think that would include any kind of offense.
Okay. Are the comments inherently offensive?
I think they're appropriate.
Okay. Do you think the comments are inherently offensive?
I think I said I think they're appropriate. I think I said that they're not appropriate in the workplace.
Right, but my question, sir, and it's, I guess, a yes or no question, do you think that the comments are inherently offensive?
I don't know what you're using the modifier inherently. Does that mean that everyone everywhere should be offended just by the asking of, again, the difference between are you gay or you must be gay? Does that offend everybody in its inherence, in its mere speaking? I'm not too sure they are inherently offensive.
Okay.
They are inappropriate, unacceptable, and unprofessional.
Are the comments offensive on their face?
I don't even know what that means.
Okay.
They're certainly offensive to some people. I gather that, I don't question that.
Is there a distinction in your mind between whether comments are inherently offensive or offensive on their face?
Well, I see what we're doing. So I'm telling you that those modifiers don't mean anything to me. The word offensive means something to me. So whether whether I'm offended by something is a personal reaction to something, given circumstances. It bothers me that people would talk like this, do this, but being offended is a different level of reaction. So, I mean, you put any modifier you want in front of it. The word, are you offended? I was not offended when I was told what he had done. I was disappointed in his behavior, his lack of professionalism, and his bad decision.
So your answers to my questions then are, yes, the comments are inherently offensive now that you
I
understand?
didn't say that.
Okay.
I said I was not offended when I was told what he had done. Other people may be offended. I don't decide whether you're offended or not, whether you have a right to be offended or not. Offense is a personal reaction to something. I was disappointed in the actions taken by my assistant chief.
Mr. Spalik, I apologize for interrupting. I think you're asking, I think the question you want to act is, based upon your knowledge of the context, do you think the comment was inherently offensive? Is that what you're seeking an answer to?
I just want to know if inherently offensive and on their face offensive have a material distinction to the chief.
Well, if someone could have a conversation with someone interested, having interest in someone who happens to be LGBT. So if it's, well, are you a member of that group? That's not offensive. But if, in another context, that question could be offensive. So are you asking the question within the context of the facts here? Or are you asking a broad question in every situation?
Okay.
That may be the chief's problem, issue, and certainly is mine. So I think we
Sure.
need to clarify the question.
Well, based off of the comments of the chair, I'll ask you that question as well. Based off of the context of the meeting, do you think that those comments that Chief Slavin made are inherently offensive?
I don't know, that's moved me off over on that in terms of being offended by something, being a personal reaction to something that individual variables will address. Is it inappropriate? It's absolutely inappropriate. But I don't know that it's inherently offensive, directly offensive. It's about whether or not it's personally offensive. Now, I would prefer people not talk like that, not do that. I obviously did not downplay or minimize, but I don't feel comfortable sitting here saying, yes, everybody everywhere at all times should be offended by that, by what he did. So when I was told, I want to tell you about me. So when I was told I did not get offended, I was disappointed.
Okay. Besides that first meeting, that first Tuesday meeting where Chief Pop and you met and Chief Pop told you about the report that Commander Minor and Lieutenant Bonnet had made, were you present in any other meetings with Chief Slavin and Chief Pop where there were discussions about Commander Minor bringing forward a complaint about Chief Slavin's comments?
I'm sure I was. I don't remember the context of the meetings.
During those subsequent meetings, do you recall Chief Slavin making statements to the effect that Commander Minor was out to get him?
I do know that Chief Slavin was feeling as though Commander Minor was not pleased about his promotion and was not supportive and had in fact made some statements. That's what those statements are regarding him. So he was, yes, he was very concerned about the relationship.
And it's your opinion, I think, if I heard your testimony right, that you think that Commander Minor should have told Internal Affairs in his first interview that he reported the fact that Lieutenant Bonnet and himself had brought this up the chain of command, right?
I think that was the right thing to do. I think that would have sped the investigation up. I think the Internal Affairs investigators would have had a much clearer record. So the answer to that question is yes.
Okay. Well, we heard some evidence earlier that immediately after the interview, Commander Minor offered to go back on the tape to discuss the reporting and how you handled the investigation to that point. Do you recall that testimony?
I recall the testimony, yes.
And you read Ms. Cronin's report, right?
Yes.
And Sergeant Galahar disclosed this to Ms. Cronin, right?
Correct.
But Ms. Cronin did not include it in her actual report. correct?
As far as I know, that's correct.
Do you think that this is evidence that Commander Minor was willing to disclose this information if Internal Affairs was interested in hearing it?
I don't know what the information was to be able to justify or explain or agree with the fact that what he was going to offer was verdict. I wish he had the opportunity to offer that, frankly, because it was about my handling of the case, which I wanted to eventually ask him to the investigation.
Can you speak up, sir?
Sorry. I wish he had, but I don't know that what Commander Minor was going to offer, sitting here not knowing what it was, would be pertinent.
Okay. Well, specifically, we have this concept that Commander Minor said about reporting this matter, right? Is it reasonable to assume, based off of the testimony that we heard from Sergeant Gallagher and from the transcript, that Commander Minor was going to talk about what he'd done previously in reporting the information forward?
I don't know that.
Okay.
I'm guessing.
So let me ask you this, because this I think you would know. Are you you're disappointed that Sergeant Lewis didn't go back on tape?
I think if in fact that exchange occurred, and I wasn't there, so I don't know for a fact it occurred, how it occurred, what exactly was said, and what context it was said. I think if it was offered to someone to go back on tape to talk about my handling of something, I would have preferred that to have happened.
Right. And you would have wanted Commander Minor, I think your testimony today is if Commander Minor had told Internal Affairs, yeah, I reported this up. I reported what Lieutenant Bonnet and I said to Chief Pop, that would make all the difference in this case, wouldn't it?
Well, he had opportunities after that to have done that. I mean, there were opportunities, he wrote an email later on, he could very easily say, no, I want to go back on tape and tell you these things, but you were going to go back on tape. He did not include that. So again, I don't know what he intended to say before he went back on tape, but he did characterize it as talking about how I handled it. It has nothing to do with what he said to Chief Pop or what he was told by his subordinate lieutenants. It was about me. So you'd have to jump to some level of supposition that he was going to go back on tape and talk about my handling and then get into the fact that he knew about this and that the lieutenant had spoken to him all the way home, texted each other. You're jumping to that conclusion. I can't go there.
Okay. Do you think that Sergeant you were here for the testimony of Sergeant Gallagher, right?
Yes, I was.
Do you think that he provided true and accurate testimony to the best of your knowledge?
I believe all the people that have spoken so far have been honest.
That is very helpful, thank you. I don't have to ask it about every witness now, I should have just said that at the beginning. So the quote from Sergeant Gallagher is, but off tape afterwards, he had said something about reporting this, or something about Rodbell handling it. Do you recall that from the
I don't
transcript?
recall that quote, so you'd have to show that in the record. I don't remember that quote.
Okay, I'm representing to you that that's the actual quote from Sergeant Gallagher. Does that change your opinion sitting here today that Commander Minor said something to the effect of, if you want to know about me reporting this, we can go back on tape?
As I just said, I believe he had other opportunities. If that was something that was bothering him, he felt he needed to reveal, he had other opportunities. In fact, sent an email giving additional information. He could very easily have done away with this particular conversation by having added in that email, I want people to know, I reported to Chief Bob Bonnet spoke to me. That would have cleared it up.
So let me ask you the question then. Had he reported to Internal Affairs on the record, one way or another, yeah, I reported this, I reported what Lieutenant Bonnet and I said, it went up to Chief Pop, Rodbell said he handled it, that would have cleared up this entire investigation?
Necessarily.
Okay.
I mean, at some point, we would be here, we may not clear it up, we wouldn't be here.
Okay.
If he had given more information to Sergeant Lewis, so Sergeant Lewis didn't have to then try to find somebody who would give him some evidence of what occurred in that room that Chief Minor was in.
Okay. Let me ask you this. You've known Commander Minor for over a decade, right?
Oh, yes, sir.
He's a smart man.
Here's a bit, yes, sir.
Do you think he cares about his career?
Yeah, I'm sure he does.
And he understands the internal investigations process, right?
But also, he worked in internal affairs.
And you thought his work product was good when he was in internal affairs, right?
And no complaint of his work.
Okay. So you knew, well, Commander Minor knew at the point that he was there that Internal Affairs was going to be interviewing everybody in the room, right?
Yes, that's yes.
Okay. And Commander Minor, sitting in that room, knew that he'd already disclosed information to Chief Pop about his concern, right?
That's true.
And Commander Minor knew that you read every Internal Affairs investigation, right?
That's true.
And Commander Minor knew that you were aware that he previously reported this issue up his chain of command, right?
That's true.
So it's your opinion that Commander Minor, and Commander Minor knows, because your expectation for your department, for everyone that wears a badge, is if you deliberately deceive IA, you're going to be fired, right?
You're pretty consistent, yes, sir.
You talk about that at briefings sometimes, like integrity is everything to be a police officer, right?
That's correct.
And it's your opinion that Commander Minor went into IA knowing all of this and just decided to provide a deliberately misleading statement?
You know, if you look at the motive, I can't figure out either. I will tell you this, that the investigation starts and is housed as a responsibility of Internal Affairs.
Sure.
Not Scott Pop, Internal Affairs. And when you're sitting with Internal Affairs, and Aaron would know this having been an investigator, when you're sitting with Internal Affairs, that's the opportunity to put everything you know, all evidence that you're aware of, on the record. It's not to take for granted that you're going to find this out anyway because you're going to talk to everybody else. It's not, I've already talked to somebody 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, however long time it was ago. You already know this, I don't need to tell you this. That's the record, that's the investigation. That's when you put on the record everything you know about the incident so that the Internal Affairs investigator can do a thorough and fair and complete investigation. And so, yes, I do think that he did all the things you've asked him, but the one thing he didn't do was what he should have done and needed to do. In fact, was, I think, required to do by bringing a complaint forward and being a witness to a complaint is giving a full statement, separate from every other full statement that comes up. Because as we've already seen, full statements can conflict. We'll see different things. Aaron's obligation was to tell Internal Affairs what he witnessed and who approached him and what he said to those people and what they said to him. And he failed to do that.
And you think he did this deliberately, right?
I've had officers that get into this particular situation and you just can't figure it out. It's like a bad decision and a costly decision, a horrific decision, one I don't enjoy witnessing. But the fact is, yeah, I do think for whatever reason, he decided not to put what he needed to put on the record,
And then right after he was on the record, the evidence shows that he said, if you want to know about how this was reported, and if you want to know also about how Rodbell handled it, I'm willing to go back on tape, right?
That's what the record shows.
So when he's still in Internal Affairs, he's actually saying, I can tell you about how I reported, and he didn't, the IA didn't take him up on that opportunity, right?
No, I can't let you put words in my mouth. I'd have to read the transcript to see exactly what Sergeant Gallagher said.
Okay. Going back to the other part about the Chief Slavin investigation, the Chief Slavin investigation concluded that Chief Slavin violated the professional conduct policy as well as the AR 333 policy regarding engaging in humor that may offend another employee, right?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And it was your determination that these sustained policy violations were not going to be subject to any written formal discipline, correct?
I had already dealt with this, and it was very clear when the complaint was forwarded that if I had already dealt with it, I wasn't going to then re-discipline, additionally discipline an employee. I don't think that's fair. I wouldn't do it to any employee. So when the report was completed and concluded, I knew nothing additional that I didn't already know. There's no reason to re-discipline an employee for something that already been disciplined.
And if I understand your answer, you're saying that the investigation didn't uncover any misconduct on part of Chief Slavin that you were not already aware of. Is that fair?
That's my recollection.
Okay.
Sir.
So the fact that you discovered that Chief Slavin's comments caused serious offense to other members of the department wasn't an aggravating factor for you?
No, I already know.
Okay. So after Chief Slavin's investigation was complete, you were aware that he made a public records request for the interviews and for the investigation?
That's my understanding, yes.
And then Chief Slavin took the transcripts to Chief Pop, and Chief Slavin showed Chief Pop what Chief Slavin thought were discrepancies in Commander Minor's statements to investigators?
Yes, sir.
And then you asked Chief Pop to look into the allegations made by Chief Slavin against Commander Minor?
That's correct.
Okay. Was this an inquiry?
Well, I think I was looking for, because I had a chief bring another issue to another chief about an employee, I wanted to get his, I don't know if I said go out and find, I said, I want you to look into this. He was, in fact, at the time, responsible for internal affairs. I believe he was in investigations at the time. So that would have been an appropriate chain of command process.
Do you consider this a fact-finding part of an investigation?
I sort of expected the chief to possibly take it to internal affairs, but in the case, but I didn't give that direction.
Okay. And in fact, he made a recommendation that Commander Minor's statements did not warrant an IA integrity investigation, right?
That was his feeling, yes.
Did you ask him why he made this recommendation?
We had a conversation about that. I don't recall what would go on the conversation. We had a conversation about why he felt that way.
What did he tell you?
That again, I can't remember, other than the fact he felt that this didn't warrant an investigation.
You don't remember sitting here today any of the reasons why he said, I don't think this warrants an investigation?
I think he didn't feel Aaron lied. I think he thought Aaron was being truthful.
Okay. And then you chose to overrule the recommendation made by Chief Pop, right?
Not immediately.
How long after that recommendation did you overrule it?
I took the case back. I reviewed it myself. I hadn't reviewed it previously. I reviewed it myself, or at least the allegation. And I felt as though Aaron clearly made truthful statements. When I figured, okay, I've got a chief over here that says he didn't, I read it and feel as though, yeah, there's some evidence of that. And so I went to get a neutral advisor to review the case and give me their opinion.
Help me out with that. So you already knew from that Tuesday after the meeting that Commander Minor had brought forward concerns through to Chief Pop, right?
Yes.
And then when you got the Slavin investigation, you read it carefully, including the interviews, correct?
Yes, I did.
So you'd originally, even before the Chief Slavin investigation was signed off on by you, you had read Commander Minor's statements, right?
Yes.
And you didn't identify at that point in time an integrity issue in what Commander Minor said.
No, I didn't, and you want the reason why?
Sure.
Okay, so when I promised POSTA, when they brought forward a complaint to reinvestigate something that had already been investigated, I told them I would limit my investigation to anything I did not already know. And if something I did not already know came up, I would consider further action. So when I reviewed the record, I reviewed Aaron's transcript to what I already knew. I reviewed Bob Barnett's transcript to what I already knew. And every other transcript I reviewed to what I already, that was the comparisons I made. I didn't compare employee to employee. I compared employee to what I already knew. Now, probably an error. I should have gone back and said, let me review everybody to everybody. But I didn't do that. My promise or commitment to POSTA was I would review this transcript to see if there's something I didn't already know. And that's how I reviewed it. It wasn't until it was brought to my attention there was a discrepancy between two parties that I realized and looked at that.
Okay. But the context that you already knew about Commander Minor when you read his interview was that Commander Minor's already reported this up the chain of command. Right?
I'm trying to remember Aaron Minor's interview and whether or not he talks about the fact that he brought up the chain of command or not. I have to review the interview.
Well, I'm saying is you knew when you were reading Commander Minor's interview.
Oh, I knew, not by the kid. Yes, I did, that's true, yes.
And that omission you didn't think was material when you read Commander Minor's interview.
Yeah, I didn't read Commander Minor's interview to look for Commander Minor's complete statements, truthful statements. I looked to see, did Aaron Minor's interview tell me something that I didn't already know? That was a limitation I put on how I was going to review that file when POSTA again asked me, something I've never done before, to reopen an investigation and consider additional discipline, which I was amazed I was asked to do that. Some places you can't do that. And so I did that under that condition, and that's exactly what I did.
So, sir, I want to make sure I understand your testimony because you said something a little different, I think. you're saying that you reopened an investigation into Chief Slavin prior to the POSA email coming in?
No, when POSA asked for it, and I told POSA what I was going to do. I'm sorry, I'm unclear.
So no investigation had happened prior to POSA's email, in your mind, right?
There didn't need to be an investigation. I had someone come in and tell me that they committed a misconduct. And as the highest ranking person in the police department who's responsible for discipline, and this person's immediate supervisor, I took relatively quick and decisive action to make sure it would never happen again. And then made sure that people knew about the action I took by having my name on the email that was sent to everyone in that room. And I find it hard to believe that the entire department didn't know about it 6 weeks later.
Okay.
I refuse to believe the fact that people didn't hear about this because Chief Slavin went around and told people what he had done.
Let me ask you this question. Did you read Lieutenant Barnett's transcript carefully for his interview that he gave related to the Chief Slavin investigation?
They did, yes, sir.
Is Lieutenant Barnett's statement about what occurred at the meeting inconsistent with Chief Slavin's statement of what occurred at the meeting that Chief Slavin gave to you?
You have to point out the section we're talking about because there are definitely some differences. I mean, Chief Bob Barnett talks about texting and phone calls back and forth and how upset he was. He does all that, but you have to point out where you think the consistency is. Again, Chief Slavin wasn't exactly crystal clear on what exactly he said, but the context was all there and the appropriateness was clearly displayed.
Bob Barnett said that this was actually, the first comment was something to the effect of, I attended a training put on by a French commander, and because he's French, we all know that he was probably gay. Do you recall that as being essentially Bob Barnett's recall?
It may be there, but I also had numerous other people in the room who said they didn't hear anything, they heard different things. So putting no more weight to one person hearing accurately over somebody else, it was clear that not everybody knew exactly what was said in that room. But I had enough of what was said in that room to know that Chief Slavin violated policy, was inappropriate, unprofessional with his comments. But again, you had many people saying different things in that room.
So is, in your mind, I'm just curious, in your mind, is stereotyping somebody about their sexuality because they're French, is that more serious than making a joke about whether a newspaper is gay?
More serious, less serious. The bottom line here is it was all inappropriate. There was no excuse for it. He was wrong. He admitted unprofessional. He was contrite. He knew that. He messed up. He came to seek me out to tell me, hey, I messed up. If he didn't seek me out, no one someone was making a complaint. At that point, no one had made a complaint. I didn't know about it. I didn't know about Aaron talking to Scott Hoffman when they talked. I knew nothing about this. He came out, sought me out, and said, I messed up. So I treat it as a part two.
So I don't have to read it again. Do you think that Lieutenant Barnett lied in his internal investigation, in his interview of the internal investigation? His statement of the internal investigation?
Sir, I've read enough internal investigations to know that oftentimes there's a perception of the person giving the insert, and I believe that line that was truthful is
To the best of his recollection?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Do you think it was a concern of yours that if someone was asked about their sexuality and people did not remember that, that may be a problem with regard to their training of sex discrimination in the workplace and racial hostile environment?
No, that's not my experience. My experience.
No, it's not your experience.
No.
Were you concerned that no one, other than a couple of officers, no one else thought, gee, is that a correct statement, that they would recall it seems to be in violation of what we were trained in our training?
It may not be a proper, it might not be a popular answer to you, sir, but I know that now.
I just want to know whether you considered that.
I did not consider that.
And it was not a concern that perhaps additional training may be necessary because apparently people didn't realize what was said.
No, I understand what happens in a room with dynamics. People don't always listen.
Right, but you had a bunch of people apparently didn't listen, and it was not a significant, apparently for a number of people, it was not a significant enough statement that they remembered it, or that they may or may not have been concerned about it, other than Lieutenant Barnett and Commander Minor. That's fair statement? I'm sorry, well, I could say something.
Yeah, and I actually want to follow up on that because you knew at that point that Lieutenant Smith had gone to Chief Slavin and said, hey, I'm hearing that there's issues with the comments that you made at the meeting, right?
That's correct.
So
I'm not too sure when I knew it was Lieutenant Smith, but I made it that day, maybe later.
So-
You spoke to somebody.
So to the chair's point, one other lieutenant had actually brought this forward to the chief to say, whoa, what happened there was wrong, correct?
That's correct.
And that lieutenant had represented to the chief that other people were actually discussing the fact that what happened there was wrong.
Okay, sir.
That's not concerning to you that members of your department are saying, hey, this is an issue?
Let's not minimize what I did. I actually, when told by an employee that they did something wrong, I took decisive, appropriate action to make sure it never happens again. It was documented and placed in his evaluation. It wasn't I ignored this. I dealt with it. And I think you have testimony from somebody saying he deals with things pretty quick. I think it was Chief Pop. Because it needs to be, it cannot sit there and it can't fester. It has to be dealt with.
Sure.
And so let's not minimize what I did do by saying I ignored all of these other things. You may feel as though I mishandled it, and I'm okay with that. But pretty much I felt as though I had a serious enough incident with my chief that I need to address it immediately, and I did.
So help me out with this, because I'd like context on that answer. So if a patrol officer goes to their sergeant and says, hey, I roughed this guy up a little bit. I don't think he's hurt very bad. I'm sorry that I did it. And the sergeant says, oh, that's okay. Here's your verbal counseling. Don't do that again. Is that an acceptable way to handle that incident?
It's not an acceptable way to handle that incident.
You need to do
It's a
fact
use of
finding.
force.
You need to do fact finding, right? To say, well, what did you do? Did you punch him? Did you kick him? Did you shoot him? All of those things would matter, right?
I don't know where a use of force, self-admission would go in terms of whether the questions and answers would start right then, or they would say, we prefer this. But in that case, this is entirely different than someone coming in. I tried a little humor. I was wrong, and me dealing with that is inappropriate. So let's not mix up a use of force with a comment, inappropriate comment, in a meeting.
Okay.
Again, Mr. Swag, I apologize. The chief is correct, that's a bad analogy. What if it was, a civilian was yelling at me as I stopped my patrol car, I rolled down the window and he was yelling inappropriate comments towards me, so I yelled back at him and swore at him. Was that enough? But it doesn't tell you perhaps that I stood out of the car, the vehicle, and put my hand on my weapon, things like that. Is that because that's not a use of force issue?
Sure, actually.
Is that a more appropriate, so you don't try and get into?
Yeah, I'll take the chair's comment, right? So let's say an officer calls up the sergeant and says, hey, I just yelled at this civilian, I said inappropriate things, I'm really sorry. That civilian might have been offended, like, I won't do it again. And the sergeant says, that's okay, you know what, don't do it again. I don't need to actually establish on the record what you said or what the words were, or I don't need to verify or try to contact that civilian. I'm just going to take your word for it and you have a counseling. Is that an acceptable way to handle that?
I suspect in my police department, in every police department in the country, that may be happening on a regular basis where people self-report to their supervisors, something they did, and supervisors do in fact handle it.
Okay. And in this circumstance, let's say that officer said, hey, I got heated, I was making a joke with a civilian and I commented on their sexual orientation. And, I think that the civilian didn't take it very well. Would you expect your department to investigate that and figure out what the comments were specifically?
I think my answer stands already to that point. If I had someone outside the organization, a citizen, making a complaint, I may handle it differently.
What about in a briefing? If an officer comes forward to us, if multiple other officers are around, and a sergeant makes a comment about somebody's sexual orientation in a briefing, and then the sergeant goes to the lieutenant and says, hey, lieutenant, I'm so sorry. I made a comment about one of my guys' sexual orientation. I was making a joke. Like, I won't do it again. And by the way, other people in the briefing are offended, potentially. There's a problem, people are talking about it. Would you expect that to be investigated, to find out what that person actually said?
I think I've already answered that. I do believe that in this situation, I handled it appropriately. I was in fact investigated in terms of how I handled it. Would I handle it differently after this experience? Bottom line is that I think I've answered that. You can add more and more and more to this. The bottom line is, the facts of this case is that my direct report walked into my office and said I made an inappropriate comment at a briefing. And I chose at that time to deal with it immediately by counseling the individual, letting him know how unacceptable it was, and making a notation as performance. If someone, the board, or anyone else disagrees with the way I handle it, and I believe the board even said, Chief, you get to handle things the way you handle things, we can criticize, and you can. This is the way I handle it. This is the fact of the case. This is how I handle it.
Well, sir,
Unless you need this for a subsequent appeal, I think you've made the point.
I don't think you answered my question about the briefing scenario that I just gave you. If a lieutenant didn't do any further fact-finding on this sergeant who made an inappropriate comment in a briefing and just said, don't do it again, here's your verbal counseling, I'll document it in your performance, would that be acceptable to you as the chief?
Part of that's not acceptable because the way you present the counseling session occurred. They don't do it again. I think that's a misrepresentation of what occurred between Chief Slavin and myself.
Okay. Let's say there was a serious conversation between the sergeant and the lieutenant. Then you're okay with the lieutenant just saying, I don't need to do fact-finding, I don't need to document what was said in the briefing, I'm good with you handling it at that level. Is that your expectation as the chief?
I suspect it's happening. I'm fine with the fact that first-line supervisors are in fact counseling their employees and dealing with behavior as it occurs.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to ask you some questions about your interview with Ms. Cronin. And I want to make sure that I understand if your testimony today is consistent with what you told her on this particular point. So you told Ms. Cronin that you wanted to give Commander Minor an opportunity in the meeting that he had with you and Chief Gandara to address the concern that Commander Minor's alleged inconsistent statements gave you. Is that accurate?
That's from the transcript?
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. But I thought you told the board today that you didn't want him to get into the facts of what happened because that's not appropriate outside of an investigation.
I may have been inaccurate when I talked to Ms. Cronin. My recollection is sitting here that I didn't ask Aaron, did you do this or did you not do this? And I did not say that.
Okay.
I said, I want you to look at this and tell me if I have any other options. Of course, I have a witness, Chief Gandara, if you want to put it on the road, but my recollection sitting here is I had no intention of asking him questions.
Well, and you were here earlier for one of the questions from the vice chair, and maybe I'm stealing from his notes, but you didn't expect Commander Minor to actually provide substantive statements or justification, because that would be inappropriate under Scottsdale's policies and the Peace Officers Bill of Rights, right?
I agree. You're right. Yes.
Okay, so that's not the time for Commander Minor to say, here's why I said what I said. That's not what you were looking for, is your
I
testimony.
was not looking for that. I was looking for what alternative do I have to going and starting an internal affairs investigation.
Yeah, and using, besides Commander Minor saying, I resign right now, there was nothing that Commander Minor would have been able to say to you at that meeting that would have stopped you from initiating an internal affairs investigation, right?
Well, the only inaccuracy there is that I didn't ask for it right now.
I agree.
I gave him time to read it, consider it, talk to you, talk to who else he wanted to talk to before telling you what his decision was.
Right.
Otherwise, yes, that's
Right, but what you did not want was for him to say, hey, Chief, this is why I said what I said at the internal affairs meeting. Okay. And it was entirely consistent with his rights in Scottsdale Police Department policy for him to make that record at the internal affairs interview that he made, right?
You mean to mention our meeting?
So it is entirely appropriate for Commander Minor to explain himself and his motivations and his reasons behind why he gave the answers that he did after he received the NOI and was on record with internal affairs in his investigation, correct?
That's the time to do it if we decide to get, if we decide to go forward with an internal investigation, yes.
Right. And then I just wanted to clarify something else. So immediately after Commander Minor's interview that he conducted with Internal Affairs for his integrity violation, immediately after that interview, the investigators came and talked to you and told you about it, correct?
I don't know about the EDC, they did come and talk to me about it, yes.
And they came and talked to you about it before they put pen to paper and wrote the report, right?
I actually don't have a recollection on that.
Well,
They may have.
the normal practice of internal affairs for you, what you want, is that in your serious investigations, the internal affairs investigators come immediately after the interview or soon after, if you're not available or whatever. But they come and brief you on what happened at the interview prior to you getting an internal report, right?
And as part of the process,
Yes.
to know where people are at, what's going on, who else they have to interview, where they're going, I do get some of that, yes.
And during that meeting, you discussed their preliminary impressions before the written report is created, right?
That may have happened, yes.
And the investigators at that time knew that you were specifically the one that ordered them to investigate these specific issues as integrity issues, correct?
I believe so, yes, sir.
And they also knew at that point that you'd already placed Commander Minor on administrative leave prior to the interview, right?
They would know that they did.
Okay.
I signed the document, they compared it.
Okay. And then you knew, based off of the based off of the report of Chief Pop, that Commander Minor, long before the union complaint, had wanted a formal investigation into Chief Slavin's misconduct, right?
Aaron Minor wanted a formal investigation. I'm not sure, I certainly didn't have any conversation with Aaron. So if you ask me, did someone tell me Aaron wants a formal investigation? I don't recall that. The formal investigation came forward again, the beginning of those.
Okay.
I never had a conversation with Aaron.
So you don't recall Chief Pop relaying that information to you? That Commander Minor and Lieutenant Bonnet want a formal investigation?
There's lots of conversations, Chief Pop, there's lots of conversations going on in the weeks. I don't remember specifically that conversation.
Okay. Did you tell Chief Pop that you could tell Commander Minor that you were handling the Chief Slavin investigation?
And handling it, I was never handling it, I handled it, so that's not a word I use, but I probably did tell him that, yes.
Okay. Your testimony today is a little different also than what you told Ms. Cronin. Today you're saying you have no idea why Commander Minor would have deliberately provided false information to Internal Affairs. Is that your testimony?
That's correct.
Okay. So you don't want the board to believe that Commander Minor is somebody who creates issues, and if they don't get legs, he backs down?
You know, the benefit of being able to sit in this room, I listened to Chief Pop's conversation as he described what Aaron had been going through after the failure to promote. And I kind of applied that to that and thought maybe that's the behavior I'm actually watching. So I'm glad to clarify that. Because at some point in time, I was concerned about why Aaron had called in the meetings, said things, and basically when things didn't occur, kind of like let it go, because that had come to my attention. But remember, I've never dealt with Aaron Minor's performance. His performance, he had a direct supervisor that dealt with his performance, his rating, the things I talked about, we gave him work on, where they were at, because I didn't follow, I should have, but they were Aaron's and his supervisors. So in this case, listening to Chief Pop, I applied that and said, well, maybe that's the behavior I saw, the disappointment not being promoted, and that was some of that.
Okay.
So to say you're right, I've altered a little bit.
Okay.
On that.
Commander Minor was never given a notice of investigation for anything related to these performance issues that you're talking about here, right?
As far as I know, but again, Chief Pop is the lead supervisor, he's not a performance plan, I know that.
Okay. And I also want to clarify something that the chair had asked previously about this implicit bias training. Chiefs and other high-ranking members of your department have gone to that training. What Commander Minor was tasked with was dealing with it for other officers and lower-level members of the department, correct?
That's correct, thanks for the clarification.
Okay. Hang on one second. Did you review the Commander Minor integrity investigation cover to cover?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Did you consider the fact that Commander Minor immediately told investigators that he believed that there was a miscommunication between himself and them during his first interview in the Slavin case?
I think that was used, yes.
And you're aware, sitting here today, that Commander Minor told investigators that he answered the question they asked rather than the question that they thought they asked?
Okay, yes.
And for you, there's no difference between knowing anyone who was directly offended versus knowing anyone who was offended?
That modifier doesn't make any sense to me in terms of like making a difference in whether you're offended or not. Or
Okay.
he was offended.
Okay. So you think directly offended means the same thing as regularly offended?
I think it's offended.
Okay. So the modifier directly doesn't mean anything to you?
Doesn't mean it to me, but it doesn't cloud the issue that the word offended is in there. So was anybody offended? Drop the modifier.
Okay.
Doesn't negate the sentence.
Okay. And then I want to clarify something that you talked about with direct examination, because I want to make sure that the board has the right understanding of Scottsdale policy. When Commander Minor was placed on administrative leave after he got his NOI, although he could talk to other people in the department, Scottsdale policies prohibit him from discussing the merits of the investigation, correct?
I'll object to the foundation.
He doesn't know?
He could answer if he does, but I'm not conceding
Okay.
for the objection that is the policy.
So are you reading from the policy?
I'm asking you a question first.
Oh, I'd like to see the policy to make sure that the question is exactly what's written.
Well, I'll rephrase the question to make it more general, and you can help me and the board understand your expectations as chief. If somebody's placed on administrative leave pending an integrity investigation, are they allowed to go out and talk to other members of the department about the issue that they're under investigation for?
I believe the NOI admonishes people from talking to other people about what they're under investigation for, with the
Okay.
exception of you, sir. They can talk to their representative.
So let me fast forward with that understanding, because there were some questions asked about this meeting between Commander Minor and Assistant Chief Pop, and whether Commander Minor should be offering Chief Pop information about a matter under investigation. Would it have been appropriate for Commander Minor and Chief Pop to compare notes about what Commander Minor is going to say during his upcoming IA interview?
Stay like that, I'm concerned about this.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if Commander Minor had actually said, hey, Chief Pop, I want to tell you why I answered the question this way, and I want to give you all that background and context, what do you think about that? Does that make sense? Should I tell Internal Affairs about what I did? That would be inappropriate for both Chief Pop and Commander Minor to participate in that conversation, right?
It's something I want to look into. I don't know exactly what happened, but Chief Pop, I instructed Chief Pop when he said when to talk to Aaron to be careful.
Right,
No idea that he was talking about the case.
right.
He didn't report back, we talked about this, we talked about that, so
And you wouldn't have wanted Chief Pop to talk to Commander Minor about the case, right?
I would hope that he know that.
And you'd also hope that Commander Minor would know not to talk about the case, right?
Yes.
I think you're doing this for my benefit, the
Yeah.
question I asked, and I appreciate the clarification.
Okay, thank you. That was the last question I had on that too, so good timing. So we talked earlier about your mantra of trying to get caught doing the right thing. You told Ms. Cronin about the criminal investigations related to the golf cart incident, and I think you said, and tell me if this is your understanding today, you did this to avoid any allegations of a cover-up, right?
When the incident occurred, use of force reports were written, documents were created to explain the use of force. I didn't see those documents, or that report wasn't brought to my attention until 3 days later. And I felt as though 3 days later, looking at the video, looking at the reports, that it would be inappropriate for me not to do a criminal investigation and to do an IA investigation, because under IA, under Garrity, you can tell a statement. And I was afraid that if I could tell the statements that in fact criminal activity had occurred, I would not be able to go back, and I would be accused of covering up an investigation by doing Garrity before Miranda. So my intention was, let's go back, we're gonna do the criminal because the report didn't match the action that was on the video. It wasn't in sync, didn't make sense. I said, we're gonna do a criminal first, and when the criminal's resolved, then we can go ahead and do the administrative into the accurate report writing and whatever. So the cover-up issue was, we can't just go right to an internal affairs investigation when there's any motive, maybe perhaps climate committees, if we can get these first. That's the context.
Do you think that issuing a verbal counseling for both unprofessional conduct and violating AR 333 and the verbal counseling which is not documented in a separate form and it occurred without an internal investigation could be perceived by reasonable people as a cover-up?
No, I'm the highest ranking official, I'm the person in charge of discipline, I'm the direct supervisor. I dealt with it, it's documented, it's filed. Whether you read how I handle it or not, I get that. I dealt with it, and I will continue.
Hang on one second.
Yes, I'm sorry. We're
Sorry. And then I'll have you repeat your answer.
I don't remember.
I'll note for the record that we're in the corporation yard, so we have some construction
If
activity.
anyone saw, I passed a note to the vice chair that went to legal counsel without us because the police opened the door to get more airflow, and that's what I was concerned about. There would be noise back there. The noise is varies. Sometimes there is, sometimes there not. Would like to keep the door open if there was no noise.
No, I agree. I'm just concerned because obviously there's some
Yeah,
jackhammering.
It was okay for a few minutes and we got over it.
And I, by the way, I appreciate the door being open when it can for ventilation, but obviously we have to just figure out the noise situation.
Thank you, proceed.
So the question, sir, is do you think that a reasonable person could, and I don't mean to have you restate anything different, I just understand there was an interruption. So the question was, do you believe that a reasonable person could view the fact that unprofessional conduct and a violation of the AR 333 policy being handled by verbal counseling without any internal investigation or documentation could be viewed as a cover-up by a reasonable person?
No, I cannot, sir. I think there's evidence that I dealt with it, it was not covered up. And to compare that to what happened on that scene where the dog dragged a man down the street on his side and he was shot 3 times with rubber bullets and the report doesn't support the use of force, is a big jump.
Okay. And I want to talk to you about the timing of the documentation, because we didn't know that until your testimony today. So your assertion is that you actually documented the verbal counseling in June. Is that accurate?
So we are in the current policy. We write performance notes, but then they are placed in the evaluation at the end of the evaluation period, and then they're destroyed. So that's what I did with this incident.
When did you write the performance notes that included this
I
information?
don't know. You have to tell me the timeline, because it has to be done by a certain time. When I write the performance notes? Oh, probably I have to speak.
Okay. And it's your testimony that you keep performance notes on your chiefs?
I